Okay, so before we get officially started, I just wanted to show these two images that have been in the press in the last few weeks. So these are two kind of spectacular images related to the origin story that we've been telling. So the upper left is a picture of a disk around a newly formed star. This is an actual astronomical image, not a computer simulation. So this is a central star surrounded by a disk of debris. The size of this disk is about the size of the solar system. This was taken with a recently built telescope that's in the Chilean plateau called ALMA. And what you can see is actually these deficits of stuff, regions where we think there isn't much gas producing emission, these rings here. And one hypothesis is that these are actually carved out by newly forming planets. That you have planets forming, and as they orbit around, they kind of suck up the gas along their orbit. And so in these images, you can actually see directly the locations where planets are forming around this star. So this is really a kind of astonishing picture, very much like what people had expected to see based on theoretical guesses of what a planet-forming disk around a young star would look like. And then the lower right is actually from yesterday. This is the European satellite Philae, I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce it, to be honest, that landed on a comet. So they took this satellite, with very carefully designed thrusters, etc., and actually landed it on this few mile wide comet. And then they're going to do, it's really just the primary science mission is going to be over in like 3 days. So they're going to do a bunch of science actually measuring what the comet is made of, etc. And then for a few hours a day over the next few months, they'll be able to continue to do science. And so this will be the most detailed information we have yet of one of the primitive bodies out of which planets like the Earth, Jupiter, Mars, etc. are made from. And so this was also, it's an astonishing engineering feat to actually be able to take a satellite from Earth and land it on a comet, and it's going to be a lot of interesting science over the next few years. So I think Charles asked, are they going to actually be able to do chemistry? And I think the answer is yes. I don't know exactly what instruments they have, but yes.
But it's not going to bring a rock back?
No, I don't think they're not. This is not going to bring a rock back, if I remember correctly. Although that is the goal in the next decades, is to actually have a return mission.
Okay, so what we're going to do today is follow directly on the lectures of last week that I think you'll probably agree were dull and uninteresting. Tim certainly has no opinions, as you've probably noticed. They're good colleagues, both on the same floor as me. So what I want to do is build on what Tim and Leslie have presented. Tim and Leslie mostly talked about sort of the fossil record and sort of where and when we emerged. And I want to try to focus here more on our culture and our anatomy and our reproductive strategies, the ways in which we differentiated ourselves as we emerged from early primates. And so here we are in the course, the emergence of humans and how we settled the Earth, and now the nature of our humanness and how that emerged and what remarkable beasts we actually are. And so I'm going to look at sort of three things. The first is sort of the anatomical and reproductive evolution as we emerged from our last common ancestors with chimps and gorillas. And then I'm going to move to sort of cultural evolution, capturing all of it in a third of a lecture. And then pick up from Leslie's theme at the end of her lecture, which is this idea of evolutionary medicine. And that the practice of medicine, I think, will start to look quite different once we take into account our evolutionary origins. And so I'm going to sort of amplify that theme that she raised at the end of her lecture. But before getting to those, I just want to sort of revisit the time scale and how we know it for our emergence, because the time scale is going to be especially important for this third part. So here's sort of a synoptic diagram of the major fossils that we have mostly in Africa of our emergence. And so fairly recently there have been two scraps. One's a skull that's incredibly valuable and one's a femur that have pushed the fossil record from around 5 million years ago back towards 7. So 5 years ago, if we'd set a section the way we had last week, we would have said the fossil record and molecular clocks basically say we diverged from chimps around 5 million years ago. These fossils are the ones that have pushed it back to 7 or 8 million years ago. And so it's always important to recognize, and critical for this lecture, that the fossil and historical records are almost always incomplete. And so when we talk about the first of anything, recognize that future finds are likely to push these dates further back in time. And of course, we have no idea how far back in time until we find them. And so we started off in Africa with Ardipithecus, and at the time this diagram was made, that was all that was known. Basically a tooth in a jaw fragment. And then at about 4.4 million years ago, Ardipithecus ramidus was found, Ardi. And so there's the skeletal remains, which is rather spectacular. And then a reconstruction. And one of you asked last time, why the fur? And so I'm going to get to that a little bit later in the lecture as to why we think there's fur there and why we reconstruct later Homo without fur. And so this is the work of Tim White and companions. It was an incredibly painstaking process. It took them 10 years to work up this fossil, and essentially no publications until they felt that they had it right, which is very, very different from people rushing to press immediately with half-baked ideas or analyses. And so Tim really has been sort of the epitome of absolutely careful scholastic science. Okay, so then back to our diagram then. The next group we look at is Australopithecus, and this thing, Paranthropus, that most of us think are also Australopithecus. It's a name after all. It doesn't have that much meaning. And so one thing I also want to emphasize in this is that basically I'm going to show you just three fossils, Ardi, Lucy in a moment, and another Homo erectus. And in fact, with just three good fossils, you can chart out the basic path of our evolution, and then there are lots of scraps. So now we're going to move to about 3.5 million years ago to Australopithecus afarensis. And this is this famous Lucy specimen. Not nearly as complete as Ardipithecus, fairly diminutive. There's a cast of this in the Valley Life Science building, one floor below where your lab is. So have a look at that if you like. And then here's a reconstruction of Lucy. So she was quite small. She's relatively small for an Australopithecus afarensis. The structure of her femur suggests very much that she was a biped. There's an angle here suggesting the legs are being brought underneath the body. And so that's the inference there. Also, this has got a fairly long neck on it. That's going to be important in a few slides from now. So that's at 3.2 million. It's been a little bit hard to date. The argument that there were bipeds at about this time, 3.5 million, was spectacularly demonstrated with the discovery of this 3.7 million years ago. These are fossil footprints. There's one individual, and then it's thought that there are two individuals walking in single file one behind the other, and then a small horse-like creature running across the back of this. So the arguments of bipedality is basically now based on these things we call trace fossils, and looks fairly robust. The assumption being that it's an animal like Lucy or Australopithecus afarensis. But note there's 500,000 years gap between those. And as we'll see when we get to us, 500,000 years can mean a lot of evolution. Dating this thing is really, really, really easy because that surface is a volcanic ash. And so you can date the ash directly, and so you know that whoever was walking on the ash was only shortly afterwards. And so here's one of the classic reconstructions with the volcano blowing the ash. They're walking on it here. I find it really interesting. I could find no images that had pictures that actually matched the footprints. There's a third individual here, or fourth or fifth, that's simply missing. And all of them want to have a nuclear family, which is really interesting. They want to have dad, mum, and baby. There's no evidence of a juvenile here whatsoever. There might have been, there might not have been. But also I think there's something here where sort of modern Western traditions of the nuclear family have actually biased our understanding of our actual evolutionary origins, which is also going to be important a little bit later. So I said no reconstructions of, say, a band of adults walking across the plain here. Okay, and then we move through a variety of beasts here to the genus Homo. It has its origins at about 2.6 million years ago, so still a very long time ago by human time scales. And also this is about the time that we get the first stone tools. And so this is Homo habilis. The taxonomy is an absolute nightmare in here. There are not many fossils. They're smashed up. You get famous for describing new species, so you don't get a lot for just saying, I've just found another one of somebody else's famous thing. There's variation between humans anyway. So if I find a really big skull and a really small skull, is it because they're different species or is it just the variation? There are not many fossils, so people get bent out of shape with the names. I think the idea of Homo is about sufficient here. And what I want to do is talk about this very famous fossil here at about 1.6 million years old, the Narukatomi boy, and I'll show you a slide in a little bit moment of that. So we've got Ardi, Lucy, and then the Narukatomi boy, and that charts out our basic evolution. And at this point, we're in Homo erectus, which is the direct ancestor of us. So I just remind you, too, that up until this point, everything has been in Africa, as far as we know. And then, perhaps coincidence with this long-legged, loping beast, we start at about 1.8 million years spreading across the globe as Homo erectus. At this time, this is a diagram that I've shown and also Leslie showed. This is a measure of the global ocean temperature. And the variation starts to go up. And about 2.5 million years ago, the variation increases. So the emergence of Homo coincides with increased intensity of the Milankovitch climate cycles that Elliot talked about a couple of lectures ago. And it appears to coincide with a drying of East Africa. So food resources became less and more patchy. And it seems to me that that's one of the selection pressures that led to the evolution of the remarkable genus Homo. And I haven't explained why it's remarkable yet, but we'll get to that in a moment. But it looks like this Milankovitch cycle, as well as this cooling of the Earth's surface, was responsible for the selective pressures that led to the fundamental shift in our ecology and biology. And so here then is this remarkably complete fossil. He's missing his feet and most of his hands. That's very, very common. They're very, very small bones. They tend to wash away. So it makes it a little bit hard to work out what's going on in terms of grasping ability, tree climbing, etc. It's about 1.6 million years old. And this is a pretty tall individual. And the guesstimates are that he's about 8 years old. Could be as old as 15, could be as young as 6. It's based on the tooth eruption pattern in the jaw. But you have to make some assumptions about the similarity which teeth erupt in Homo erectus 1.6 million years ago and its relationship to the way our teeth erupt as modern humans. So it's a little bit tricky. But the thing is, he's really tall. And so the sense is that these Homo erectus were very tall individuals, probably about the same height as us, but as I'll show you later in the lecture, we are remarkably tall compared to most of the history of Homo sapiens. And if any of you have been in historic ships, say in the UK, the decks are about this tall. So I'm not particularly tall. I'd bang my head on the ceiling. So if you look at almost all the old buildings and ships back to the 17, 18, 1600s, we've put on dramatic height in the last couple of hundred years. So these were towering individuals compared to what most of the history of Homo sapiens is, and we'll get to the shrinkage also a little bit later. And so there's a reconstruction of the Narukatomi boy, and they've done two things here. He's almost hairless, and we'll get to that reason in a moment, and he's running, and we'll get to that in a moment. And so origins, 2.4, 2.6 million. Kind of a little bit disturbing that all the fossils come here from the African Rift Valley. And the question is that because of where we evolved, or is that because where we can find fossils? Because it's sitting in a rift where sediment accumulates. And interestingly, we know that the chimp lineage had to coexist with us all that time, and the gorilla lineage had to coexist with us all that time, and the number of fossils that belong to the chimp lineage is round like a donut. None. And the number of fossils that belong to the gorilla lineage that we know must have coexisted at that time and not too far away is 1. So we have an enormous number of fossils on our lineage because we're living in the rift here where those floods that Tim talked about happen. So it does make you wonder if we had a better fossil record elsewhere. Now, those two older fossils I talked about at 7 or 8 are not from the rift. So there are fossils elsewhere, and they're rare. But we have this special window. Now, it's a good place. There's water, there's animals coming in, so maybe that is the cradle of Homo sapiens and Homo erectus. But it might just also be because that's where the lamppost is. So that's where you search for the keys, if you're stretching the metaphor a little bit. Okay, so then at about 1.8, we have fossils here in the Middle East. We're out of Africa. Who knows, we might find earlier ones. And then here, 1.4 in China, just younger than 1 million in Java. So this is Java man sitting in here. And then also in Europe, 800,000 years ago. So Homo erectus spreads across the globe, which is probably related to this issue of the capacity for running and the need to search for rare food resources, which was probably not true in Ardipithecus' time and Lucy's time, where food was more abundant and they were not built for long-distance locomotion. And then I just want to remind you then, as a completely separate invasion out of Africa is Homo sapiens, that seems to have its roots about 160,000 years ago. So instead of, that's 0.16. So instead of 1.6 million years ago for Narukatomi boy, it's 0.16, so it's 10th the age. So really shallow in time. And then these invasions across the world, 40,000 years into Europe, 70,000 years into South Asia, and then East Asia, 50,000 years into Australia, into the Americas by 15,000 years, 12,000 here, 14, perhaps by boat, in southern Chile, the Maori in New Zealand only 800 years ago. So the settling of the Pacific, it's been squished here, the Hawaii's been knocked out. The settling of the Pacific is really, really recent by the Polynesians. Madagascar at 15,000, and these people actually came from Southeast Asia that came from Taiwan. So they came out of Taiwan into Borneo. One group went to Madagascar, the rest of them went to Papua New Guinea, waited for a while, and then started to spread across the Pacific. Okay, so what were the selective pressures that shaped Homo erectus? We'll argue that it's sort of scarcity of food. Is there anything special that we do as a genus? And so it's question time. Do we do anything special as a genus compared to other primates? So I could have put a lot of things up here. Cooperation, obligate tool use, language, running. Type in your own answer. Okay, what do we got? What do you think? So we have running, which I've already said, so that's good. We have blue, white, and green, all four. Okay, so it looks like we have enhanced cooperation. And so that's going to be important. It looks like we become obligate tool users, and it's partly because everywhere in Africa you start to find these crude stone tools. So as we'll see in a moment, there are lots of animals that use tools, but there's none of them that actually rely on it. And we seem to start to rely on the use of tools. Language looks like probably not, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the lecture. Language looks like it emerges much, much later. Certainly with Homo sapiens, and perhaps some time after the origin of Homo sapiens. And then running looks like it's important. So key to understanding our success and our health problems today is recognizing that we added hunting to our gathering lifestyle. So gorillas and chimps gather mostly vegetable materials. We added hunting. So Homo erectus, and for most of our history, Homo sapiens, were hunters and gatherers. Why? Well, one of it appears to be related to the increased brain size, which requires higher nutrition food and more nutrition. And these things probably feed back on each other, as Tim White pointed out. I can map the world better if I have an increased brain size. I need more food to gather food to feed the brain. And hunting becomes a major source of our diet. We get an increased sophistication of tools with the emergence of Homo erectus from the earlier Homo. And there's also increased pressure for social cooperation. If I'm out hunting for wild game and I don't find any, I might have run 20 kilometers and come back again, what am I going to do for dinner tonight? But if other members of the group are preparing food in another way, then I'm fine. So if I can start to differentiate food gathering practices where some people are gathering roots, nuts, tubers, while others are out getting high nutrition food, it's okay if they fail. Where all other animals basically just gather the food just for themselves, plus or minus. There are a few exceptions. And so this means increased pressure for social cooperation. And in fact, one of my feelings is that one of the primary drivers of the increased brain size is, in fact, social cooperation and social manipulation and status building. And there's a very nice story of in the chimpanzees where there's an alpha male that's getting long in the tooth and getting weak. And there is two upcoming young males, either of which was strong enough to depose the alpha male. But they didn't, because the older male was playing them off against each other. So they didn't care about the old guy. They were worrying about the other one the same age. And so what he would do is give them access to females that they really wouldn't have access to if they were not the alpha male. So the two of them are basically vying with each other, waiting until one of them thinks they're superior, and then they're going to bump off the old guy and outcompete their younger one. So social manipulation is critical to reproductive success. And so there's tool use and language and all sorts of other things, but I think this sociality is really the thing that dominates the early selection, as well as the capacity to hunt. And so our brain size is remarkable compared to other living primates. An interesting bias in this thing. I'm a paleontologist, so there are lots of primates missing from this diagram. Australopithecus, Ardipithecus, Homo erectus. So this is the gorilla. This is the orangutan. This is the chimp. And so our brain size is a lot bigger than the rest of them. We sit way outside the trajectory of other primates. So something weird or special has happened to us to cause that break from the pattern of the standard relationship of body mass versus brain size. So here it basically says all the primates are following the same basic rule, and the brain size is simply a function of their body size. But for us, it doesn't. It does something different. Now, this increase in body size has also got deep social implications as well as energetic implications. And so here's a diagram of the development of the human brain. The huge brain development occurs basically after birth. And so here's the trajectory of a brain growth against body weight for chimps and gorillas. And so early on, there's no difference. You take a human fetus and a chimp fetus, and their brain sizes are the same given their size. They start to diverge late in pregnancy, but when they're born, the human brain size is not a lot bigger than a chimp brain size. But then we have this extended period of brain growth after birth. That puts enormous demands on the parents to feed the growing brain. Also, while the brain grows in this way, the individual is not able to look after itself particularly well. So it puts enormous resources in looking after and feeding while this brain grows, and then the human adult there. So there's a very, very heavy burden on parental care, which ties back into the sociality. So I can gather more food because I'm a hunter and I'm mobile, I'm dividing up the way we gather and hunt. But also the fact of the larger brain means that I'm now becoming dependent upon that increased nutrition that's coming from the hunting. And what we're going to see is a transfer of that really late in our history to agriculture. But for most of our history, it's dominated by adding meat to our diet via hunting. And so here is a map of brain sizes from the fossil record. So this is this Sahelensis, the first one I showed you at 7 million. There's Ardipithecus. There's Lucy. So she has a larger brain volume than Ardipithecus. There's the Narukatomi boy sitting in there. And through evolution, you can see as Homo erectus evolves, it gets a larger brain size. So the splitting up into the species is a little bit artificial. There's really sort of a continuity of increased brain size. And we tend to like to break things into categories, but it's a little bit artificial. And then there's Homo sapiens, and I didn't label it, but Neanderthals are sitting in there. And they have essentially the brain size as us. For me, when I teach other courses on this, I actually talk about Homo sapiens neanderthalis and Homo sapiens sapiens. I view us as just being subspecies of each other. We're not separate species. Question?
Where are gorillas in relation to
Gorillas are much larger. Are they? No, they're not much larger. Gorillas, sorry, let's go back and find out. Gorillas here were at about 300. Yeah. So chimps and gorillas are sitting in here somewhere. Yeah, question.
Is the brain volume directly proportional to intelligence?
Is brain volume directly proportional to intelligence? I think in the crudest sense, the answer is going to be yes. It is tricky because the way the brain processes is not directly related to the volume. It depends on the extent to which the brain differentiates into different functions and the way they can talk to each other. And obviously here, there are very, very different brain volumes in here for Homo sapiens. But that doesn't correlate directly with intelligence. I've discovered that I have an unusually small head. So when my daughter went in for her 3-month evaluation, they said, whoa, really small head. And then the nurse looked at me, measured mine, and said, it's okay. When I go into caves or mines, I have to put my hard hat on sideways because it's too wobbly front ways. So now most of my family thinks I'm retarded, so maybe there's a correlation between brain size and... So anyways, you can see there that this is living humans. So there's a crude correlation, but it's really crude. Okay, and then finally I want to get to this point here. Here's one here that seems to buck the trend. It's got a very, very small brain size. It's quite recent, about 90,000 years to about 13,000 years ago. Any idea who that is? Yeah. Yeah, the hobbits. It's from the island of Flores in Indonesia, which is just east of Java. It's next to the island of Komodo, where the Komodo dragons come from. And there's the skull there. And so these things were called hobbits until, I think it was Hollywood says you can't use that word in public lectures. So I'm not supposed to use that word, but I'm calling them hobbits nonetheless. And hope no one's going to report me. Oh, it's recorded. And it's actually, oh dear, I'm in trouble now. Yeah, so you guys aren't Well, I'm not, that's not going to. So you're not paying directly for this lecture, so maybe it's okay. But you are paying for education, so maybe it's not okay. Here we go. So these are the tools that seem to emerge with the origin of Homo. And then these are the more advanced tools that show much more sophistication, sinisterity, which most of you would call dexterity. Dexterity means the capacity to use your right hand well. I'm left-handed. That's sinister, so I have sinisterity. So I'm ambidextrous is silly. It's both right-handed. Well, I'm ambisinistrous, not ambidextrous. So really, really spectacular use, but still very stereotyped. And these emerge about the same time as Narukatomi boy. So as we start to go into this wandering across the globe, capacity to run, hunter-gatherer, we also have more sophisticated tools, presumably related to the capturing and eating of meat, where these guys were probably not dealing with meat very often. Chimps do occasionally, cows occasionally eat mice. I mean, things aren't exclusive. But so this corresponds, again, very sharply, I think, to our new biology, the hunter-gatherer biology. Now, I just want to note that there are many species that use tools, and one of the most remarkable are crows, and I couldn't get my video download to work here. Here's a crow where they've cruelly put some food floating out of the reach of his beak, and what he does is he starts to drop these bricks into the water to get the water level up so he can eat it. And he's savvy. He picks one of these things up that's too light to sink, he just chucks it away. So he picks up the thing that's too light, chucks it, picks up a heavy one, puts it in here, and slowly gets it. They've also been known to take wire and bend them into hooks so they can open things to get food. So they're really quite remarkable. And here's a video here of a crow where they've given it some food, and then they've been cruel and put it in a deeper tube. And so what he's got here is too short. So now he's going to scrape out a tool that's longer so that he can scrape out a tool that's even longer. Oops, doesn't fit. But he doesn't go to the wrong ones. And then gets the food. So we can just look at these ones here and say, no, those are the wrong length for me. I don't want those. I've got to get the next longer one so I can get the next longer one. So sequential tool use to problem solve occurs in other species. And there's another video that I couldn't get to download of a badger in South Africa. Perhaps you've seen this. It pushes rocks and piles them up so it can climb out of its cage. It grabs rakes and puts them up against the wall so it can climb out. It manipulates tires and so it can undo locks. So there are lots of species that can manipulate the world to get things. But we seem to do it in an obligate way that's tied to our diet. Okay, so now look at anatomical and reproductive evolution. I want to look at the hunter-gatherers and the endurance running, and then the invention of childhood and concealed ovulation. Well, I really mean just unusual aspects of reproductive biology compared to other primates. And so is there anything special that we do as a genus? And the answer is endurance running. And so Homo is often portrayed as a feeble genus. Here are these amazing fangs of a baboon. Here's the amazing fangs of a gorilla and chimps. And again, I couldn't get it to download, but I found a video of a sumo wrestler taking on an orangutan that's half the weight. She's like 180 pounds, and he's 363 pounds. And in a tug of war, she wins easily. She just pulls him into the mud, just jump when she gets annoyed. He keeps on trying to pull her in, and she gets annoyed, and then she's fed up with this joink. So we are really weak when it comes to that sort of muscular strength. And so, in terms of, our vicious look, fearsome canines. It's interesting that we like to dress up as Dracula. We can sort of perhaps feel our evolutionary heritage in the sense of fierceness and fangs. But what it does seem to be that we have lots of innovations for running, and specifically endurance running, not sprinting, but endurance running. And there are lots of aspects of the anatomy, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, but here's a chimp, Lucy, Homo erectus, and then Homo sapiens. And I just want to go through a few of these because they're very interesting. The first one is that we've stabilized our head, so our magnum foramen, where our nerve and our backbone attaches, is adjusted so the head sits very comfortably up on top with balance, and we run our head barely bobs. If you're running a long distance, you don't want your head going backwards and forwards like that. That's going to wear you out really fast. So there are a bunch of anatomical changes in the neck region with that. And then there's all sorts of decoupling of the head from the thorax from the pelvis. And so this is for counter-rotation of head versus trunk versus hip. And so when my wife is trying to get me to practice this. I can walk, right? I can decouple. Chimps can't do that. They're just blocks. So a chimp has to go, whoops, I can't do it, like this, right? It can't decouple what its hip's doing from its trunk. And it can't decouple its head easily from its trunk. But when you run, the way it works, right, your chest is swiveling in the other direction from your head, from your hips. Backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. That dramatically increases the efficiency with which you can run. And so part of it is that chimps and gorillas and Lucy's have this huge musculature that goes right from the shoulders directly onto the head. We've created long, beautiful necks. It's interesting that things that we view as beautiful also correlate with our function, running, hunting, gathering. We've created these long necks, and we've developed a very, very strong and powerful nuchal ligament to help stabilize the head. So horses do the same. Some of the Diplodocus dinosaurs do the same. Rather than using muscle to stabilize the head, there's a ligament that's springy. So we've got lots of modifications. There's sort of the development of a slender neck and decrease of the musculature that goes straightly onto the head there and bringing the head back on top of the backbone, unlike a chimp that's way forward. So big differences there. We increase our stride length by increasing the length of our legs. The Narukatomi boy is very tall compared to Lucy, chimps, and even gorillas. Now, when we walk, we basically are pendulums. I pick up the leg, and my leg just swings forward. Just swings. It swings backwards and forwards. But when I run, I'm basically a two-legged pogo stick. You spring, the elastic energy is stored in your ligaments, and then released again. And I didn't put a picture in, but kangaroos that hop have these incredibly long ligaments that elastically store the energy and then release it again. And so we have these incredibly long Achilles tendons compared to modern primates. And in fact, what happens by the time you get to your mid-40s is you start to lose the elasticity in your tendons and ligaments. And what happens? We start to need these bloody things, glasses. I know some of you have them already, but they're new to me. Because you start to lose the elasticity required for adjusting your vision. How many international soccer or rugby players are there in their mid-40s? None. Because you start to lose sufficient elasticity that you can't compete against the younger athletes. So the elasticity is critical for the running. We've developed a huge arch in our foot to absorb the impact of landing when we run. So our arch foot is not present in any other primates or in Lucy. And we have all sorts of structures, including the way our heel is oriented, for stabilizing the foot as you run. You know, if you're running fast, your foot's a long way up in the air, it's going to hit the ground fairly hard. It's got to hit flat and stay flat. And so it turns out that our anatomy is replete with modifications compared to Australopithecus that seem to be designed specifically for running and endurance running. And we can run long distances for a long time. And so we do this. A lot of people jog. About 10% of Americans run regularly. And so Homo is a specialist endurance runner matched by no other primate. So completely different biology. Emerging at about 1.7 million years ago. And only disappearing, as we'll see, about 10,000 years ago. So about 99.5% of our evolutionary history has been dominated by endurance running, hunter-gathering. And the question is, how has that shaped our health and our bodies, and how have we undone that in the last tiny 0.5% of our history? And so there are other species that are specialist endurance runners. Hyenas. I'll ask the question. I'm telling you. We'll just do it. Hyenas and African wild dogs will run anywhere between 10 and 20 kilometers a day in pursuit of prey. Horses can go 100 kilometers in a day if pushed hard enough. Wildebeest, similar thing. So there are other species that are built for endurance running, but amongst the primates, the relatively few of them, amongst primates, we're the only one. So let's go back to this issue of Ardipithecus is drawn as hairy, and Homo erectus is drawn as fairly hairless. And the question is why? And so the question is, how do most mammals lose heat when they overheat? No, they do not sweat. You do. You're a Homo sapiens. You're an endurance runner. They pant. Lions pant, tigers pants. Poor thing. So that's how mammals lose excess heat. We pant. Sweat glands are kind of useless if you have thick fur, right? You're going to be exposed to the air so you can evaporate. So instead, we sweat and have huge numbers of sweat glands, which don't work too well with thick fur. So that's the reasons why they're drawn relatively hairless, because we've shifted the way we dump excess heat. Elephants get in water and flap their ears. They're fairly hairless too because they're huge. So pretty interesting, right? So that's another big difference from us and, say, Australopithecus and all the other primates, chimps and gorillas that have really, really thick fur. Yeah?
Do we know when this transition happened, or is this just a guess?
So the guess is that it's associated with the beginning of endurance running. Because if I'm going to run 20 kilometers, I'm going to be in a heat deficit problem. So that's just the guess. So that's why. So this is an inference based on this observation. But that's the reason why we're drawn as relatively hairless, though, as Tim pointed out, we're still covered in hair, just really, really tiny. Also, too, I mean, we add about 3 to 5 million sweat glands as we grow, so it's an enormous number of them. It also turns out that the number of sweat glands that you grow is partly a function of the temperature at which you grow up at. So if you grow up in a place where you don't need to sweat, you have less sweat glands. So that's not in your genes, it's in your physiology that then affects the way you function as an adult. Question? Oh, so why is sweat glands rather than panting? Well, panting, the problem with panting is that it's only a tiny part of your body that you're losing the heat from. But if you have sweat glands across your whole body now is an evaporative surface rather than just your tongue and your mouth. So that would be an advantage of that. You dramatically increase the surface area. Your whole body becomes... Okay, the dog's cute. Okay, so now I want to move to sort of our reproductive biology. And our reproductive biology is really, really strange. The endurance running is strange. But the reproductive biology is really strange compared to other primates. And it's strange in many ways. So what I want to do is just point out first this diagram here. So for monkeys that have tails and the great apes that don't, chimp and early hominins, as we'll see in a moment why, there's the infant stage, which is basically breastfeeding. And then when breastfeeding, weaning stops, then you go into a juvenile or adolescent phase where the individuals basically can fend for themselves, but they still need some sort of protection and training from their adult parents and tribe members. But for us, we've invented something called childhood. We're the only primate that has childhood. And so what childhood is that the child has been weaned, it's no longer breastfeeding, but the child still can't find its own food. So it's still dependent on parents or other adults for food or older siblings. And only later, at age 8, 9, 10, can they start to actually find enough food for themselves. And this corresponds to this incredible time of socialization and of rapid brain growth. So we've invented a brand new developmental stage that we call childhood. Now, there's increased parental investment now. Partly, too, we've also extended our growth period till about 15, 18, until we're fully adult, which is way late compared to a chimp and gorilla that's more like 6 years. So the parents have to pay more attention to the children for much, much longer. It requires much, much more energy because of our huge brain. And yet the frequency of pregnancies in humans is higher than in chimps and gorillas, or it used to be. And so chimps and gorillas tend to reproduce about every 3 years, but Homo sapiens, every year and a half is pretty typical until contraception was invented. So there's more investment for each child, and there's more children. What a nightmare, right? Why are we doing this? And so we're completely shifting our reproductive biology in a way that's becoming incredibly energy demanding on the society and culture. And so female, almost anythings, chimps, gorillas, cats, dogs, one female basically can look after the entire set, the litter. But for humans, it can't be done, right? You need at least the father's help, but often grandmothers, sisters, the rest of the family. And so this, coupled with childhood, coupled with large brain size, means that the bringing of children becomes a communal exercise. It's no longer just the mother's responsibility, as it is in almost all other animals. So again, this sociality now is tied into our reproduction as well as to our hunting, what we've added to gathering. And it's locking us in now into sort of a social fabric that is necessary for our survival. There are other really weird things that seem to be associated with this. This is sort of controversial as to the reasons. The facts are not. Human females don't go into heat, but instead have concealed ovulation. You don't know when you might get pregnant. For all other animals, they can't get pregnant until they can, and when they can, they advertise it to the other sex. So he's sniffing for signs that she's ready to have to get pregnant. And there are some primates that do this in a spectacular way. Most mammals are nose-driven, we're sight-driven, and some primates are sight-driven too. And so when they're in heat, macaques and chimps, bonobos, do this spectacular advertising. I want to get pregnant. Right? We don't do that. We conceal it. Now, it turns out it's not properly concealed, and so this is my wife's fault. So there are two experiments that show that, in fact, there's some information. So there's an experiment where someone went to strip clubs and worked out how much money the strippers were making as a function of whether or not they were ovulating. And it turns out that when they were ovulating, they got more money when they were not. And as a control, the strippers who were on the pill had no change through the month, the amount of money they were bringing in. So the question is it the female advertising to the males that they're a little more receptive, or are the males picking something up regardless of what the females are like? We don't know. The second piece of evidence that our ovulation is not completely cryptic is that women in dorms tend to have their periods at the same time. They synchronize. So that means then that there's some information being communicated, and I suspect it's pheromonal in some sense. There's hormones involved, and that's probably being secreted through the skin and being picked up. But in other words, there's some communication, so it's not completely cryptic, but it's way cryptic compared to this, right? Okay. So then we have another really, really bizarre things. Chimps and gorilla females will have offspring until they die. Bang. We don't. We go through menopause. Well, the royal we. Women go through menopause. We call this the grandmother effect. So here's a daughter, a mother, and a grandmother. Her body has given up the capacity to reproduce, perhaps in part so that her wisdom and knowledge can be passed down to her offspring, her mum, her daughter, to help bring up the granddaughter. So we get this cross-generational investment in the offspring. But we are one of the only species where females sort of give up the capacity to reproduce. Most species will reproduce until they die. We don't do that at all. Question?
Is this the case when lifespan is shorter, like male lives like 30?
Yeah, so obviously, good question. So obviously, when does this occur? So if 5,000 years ago, if I'm only going to live to 30 and I'm a woman, then I'm not going to be giving up my reproductive success. But even though the average age, it might be 30, there's still women who are getting to 50, 60, 70, even in those times. So it's not like everybody died at 30. So that's really interesting, right? The other thing, which is related to all this, is that unlike other primates, we share our offspring. They grow up together, they go backwards and forwards between different families. Again, in the Western nuclear family situation, that doesn't happen nearly as much, but in many, many other cultures it does. And one thing that is really bizarre about us is that a baby gets born. What's the first thing that happens when you have a celebration of the baby? And what happens to the baby? It gets passed around, right? You pass it around. No other primate does that. Absolutely not. Chimps or gorillas or orangutans, they keep their babies with them and nobody touches them ever. Ever. Giving the damn baby all over the place. Right? So our existence as social beings is fundamentally unique to us as primates. And it's all tied in with the large brain size, the hunter-gathering, the meat, the grandmother effect, the concealed ovulation, which helps tie the male to the female. So really, really spectacular dimension of the childhood. So biologically, we are extraordinarily strange, and it's not just our brains and our tool use. So why the massive investment, the increased energy needs for our large brain? The brain's only about 2% of our mass, but it takes about 20% of our resting energy. And this is tied back into the need for meat. Social cohesion and later language and culture probably played a major role in determining which tribes were able to pass their genes on to the next generation. If food is really short and we're beginning to starve, if I can go out, send some males out to hunt some animals and they're successful and bring it back and somebody's looking after the kids, that tribe is likely to make it into the next generation more than one that can't do that. So what happens is you start to get natural selection moving in addition to evolution selection on individuals, but also to groups, to tribes. And so I think the argument is the kin group or the tribal group starts to become one of the units of selection. And I think it explains our incredible propensity to fight amongst tribes. Serbs versus Croats when I was a kid in Yugoslavia. Russians versus Ukrainians. Protestants versus Catholics in Northern Ireland. We have incredible propensity to fight each other, particularly when resources are scarce. That's happening in Syria now in a particularly strong way. And I'm struck by this photographs you see on the web with ISIS and things like that of the various ethnic groups, the Kurds and everyone being driven out and slaughtered by ISIS. When you look at the environment, it is awful. It's just straight desert. There's no water, there's no forest, there's virtually no plants, there's no animals. There is an incredible resource deficiency. So you have lots of individuals fighting for resources, and we resort to tribalism. So I think tribalism is the warring nature of tribalism is the flip side of all the social cohesion that's fairly unique to us. Other species don't have wars because they're basically not tribal. Chimps are to some extent. They're more associated with individuals or smaller groups. Yeah, meerkats are a little bit that way too, so there are others. Okay, so now I want to move into cultural evolution. And obviously when I've got large individuals that I'm starting to differentiate responsibilities, I can start to do other things. So before we get there, I want to ask this question: when did language evolve? Was it at the hunter-gatherer stage at 1.6 million years ago? Was it the emergence of first Homo sapiens, which, as far as we can tell from the fossil record, is 160,000 years ago? Is it the time at which first art appears, which, as we'll see, is about 40,000 years ago? Is it the time at which writing appears, which, as we'll say, is in the order of about 8,000 years ago? So where's language? When did it appear? And how would we know? So one way to think about the problem is, when do you think language becomes necessary to perform some of the functions that are unique to us? Is it necessary when you're starting being a hunter-gatherer? So what do you think? First Homo sapiens, first time art appears. We've got one with the first Homo erectus. Yeah, okay. So the answer is we don't know. Sorry. It's really hard to get evidence for it. So I want you to think about what the arguments would look like. Now, we know a little bit. I couldn't find a good slide of this. If you take a chimp neck vertebrae and look at the size of the holes for the spinal cord, for the nerve, it's really small. You look at ours, it's really big. So we have a huge bundle of nerves coming out of the head down into our body. And one of the thoughts is that part of that increased number of nerves going down to our body is to help control the thorax and the diaphragm for speaking. It's a fairly sophisticated process. We have one neck vertebrae from the Narukatomi boy at 1.7. And his neck vertebrae is the same size as a chimp. So that if the size of the nerve cord going down into the trunk has anything to do with language, Homo erectus did not have it. So we don't know. It's pretty problematic. With the origin of first Homo sapiens 160,000 years ago, possibly. By the time you get art, it seems like probably you needed language if you're going to communicate things richly enough. Who knows? Maybe it's the first time of writing. By the time you're writing, you have to have language, right? So, hedging one's bet, probably sometimes after the emergence of the first Homo sapiens, but before first writing. And I don't know how to do much better than that. So that means what? Maybe as deep as 100,000, but probably earlier than 10,000. So we don't really know. So the other issue here, which is interesting, is that chimps have this sort of, if you think of the air coming in here and then down the throat, and even archaic humans, which is sort of just before Homo erectus, the throat is still very, very short. And for us, what we've done is we've lengthened out the throat and shortened the face. And it turns out that this leaves an open space that makes it much easier to make a whole range of different sounds acoustically. So in terms of acoustic skill, chimps and gorillas can't do it. Their architecture isn't right. And it looks like the first Homo, the ones that are using those crude tools, couldn't do it either. So it's hard to know. It looks like there's probably some selective pressure on this. What's one of the negative consequences of creating this open space here? Choking. So Homo sapiens has a choking risk that the other primates don't have. So that suggests that there's positive selection for the space, which is offset a little bit by the choking risk. So that certainly is another argument suggesting that language was certainly not here, but it had to be after the origin of Homo sapiens itself at about 160,000. Yeah, question, sorry. Yeah. Okay, so how do you differentiate language and communication? Almost all species have a huge array of ways of communicating with each other. Think of your dog whimpering as opposed to barking, growling. So language is both, we'll get to that a little bit when we get to writing, but language is both the capacity to sort of form symbols that have very specific meanings, but also linguists will apply some sort of formal syntactical structure to it. Nouns, verbs, adjectives. And so language is considered to be all of those things. Question?
Did language probably evolve independently in different groups, or did it come up once?
Yeah, did language evolve separately? We're back to the out of multi-regional versus not. Hard to know. My suspicion is only once. But, yeah.
If it was only once, can we use linguistics?
Yeah, so we'll get to that. So the question, if it only one, can we use linguistics to work it out? And I'll get to that in a moment. Yeah, so let's look at the evolution of art. So the first depiction of animals in cave art is about 40,000 years ago, recently discovered, well, not recently discovered, recently dated in Sulawesi. So all the textbooks have art originating in Europe. Now this is interesting. This is pictograms. These caves are now properly dated in high 38,000, 40,000 in Sulawesi, which is near Borneo, Papua New Guinea, Java, Southeast Asia, just north of Australia. And then here, the oldest cave paintings in Europe are about 32 to 30,000 years ago in France and in Spain. And the question is, if I've got this sort of art, do I have language? And I don't know. So I don't know how to answer that formally. There are 340 caves now in France and Spain that have art in it of some kind. So they're fairly frequent. And then here's a rather spectacular case of a much younger cave 12,000 years ago. As I go back to this issue, here's a depiction of animals in France at 32,000 years ago. Here's a depiction of what looks like a wild boar or a pig or something at 40,000 years ago, the whole globe across. So how does that spread? So is that sort of spontaneous emergence? Is there enough gene flow between Europe and Southeast Asia? The mitochondrial DNA tree you looked at had Papua New Guineans scattered throughout the tree. So maybe there's actually more gene flow than you might think across the globe on a 1,000-year time scale. 1,000 years, a millennium is a long time. And if there's trade. But this is an interesting conundrum that language presents as well. And then this is the oldest art in the Americas in Argentina at about 13,000. The earliest archaeological evidence of Homo sapiens in the Americas is about 14,000. If there aren't any caves, we haven't found them yet, you're not going to find it. So, okay, farming. Now, farming is critical. Actually, I'm running too slow here. I'm going to speed up. Farming emerges here at about 10,000 years ago. Population sizes, as far as you can tell, are already growing, which suggests there's now increased pressure on getting food. Hunter-gathering works well, but you can deplete the stocks. If you farm, then you control your own food production. Instead of waiting for them to find the mango tree to collect the mangoes, you just grow them. So farming emerges 10,000 years ago, very recently. The oldest records of it are here in the Fertile Crescent, which is not even vaguely fertile anymore. Iran, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Syria. Why? Because we've had 10,000 years of drying. So ostrich eggs, the date for 10,000 years, show that they're feeding on lush plants. They're called C3. The ostrich eggs now, in the last few hundred years, are C4. They're grasses. So the Fertile Crescent is no longer, but it was, Euphrates and the Tigris. So things have changed dramatically. And this diagram just shows when farming started to emerge. 10,000, 7,000, 8,000, 5,000, 5,000, 4,000, 8,000 in China, 8,000, 10,000, 7,000. So farming starts to emerge, probably in part as a consequence of this population pressure. Or people you need to support your food way. And then it's a problem. Once farming becomes successful, population suddenly jumps up to really big numbers now, 16 million. It's not that big, it's 16 million. But now you can't go back to hunter-gathering because there's too many of you. So it's like this ratchet. Once you start to become dependent on farming, you're stuck with it. Or other ways of industrial producing food. You can't go back. So we have this ratchet in our evolution. And then farming just becomes really spectacular. So rice paddies in northern China. And then if you catch it at sunset, it's just glorious, right? It's a wholesale modification of the landscape now to support large numbers of individuals. So now our social behavior is causing a permanent change in our culture away from hunter-gathering. 10,000, 8,000 years ago. So really recent compared to Homo sapiens at 160,000 and a Homo at 1,600,000, 1.6 million. With agriculture, we can accumulate surplus wealth. You need to account for the surplus, perhaps. So is this the beginning of the motivation for writing? You can build religious structures. You're sedentary, so you can build things rather than if you're being nomadic. I mean, who's going to invest the time if you're always hungry and you've got to find food? You can store material objects. So we can make material objects way back to 2.6 million. At 1.6 million, more sophisticated tools, but now you can make more sophisticated, bigger things rather than just sort of leave them and wandering off somewhere. But you can't go back. Too many people to be supported by the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So this represents a fundamental change in our biology when this starts to happen. This is a really interesting shift. So this is 10,000, 8,000 years ago, depending on where you are. There are still hunter-gatherers today, like the Bushmen, the Kalahari Bushmen in Africa. So there are, it's not universal. There are some tribes in Southeast Asia that have gone back to hunter-gathering. The suspicion actually is they're a bunch of naughty adolescents that got thrown out of the tribe in Thailand, and they went back to becoming hunter-gatherers because they basically got chucked out of the farming communities. So there's complex social interactions. So now writing, what's the earliest evidence of writing? Now, just because the early evidence is proto-writing. So there are tortoise shells in caves in China almost at 9,000 years ago in northernmost China, where they clearly look like writing. There are these tablets in Romania, about 7,300. And then also in Romania, this is sort of a collection of all the symbols that have been found on various tablets and pottery in Romania. It's called proto-writing because there's no evidence of any syntactical structure. Subject, object, verb. Those structures aren't there yet. They might have been there, but they're not being expressed yet. But that's very telling, that they're just symbols representing things. There's often also tick marks going back to around 10,000 years where people are sort of putting notches in bones, 1, 2, 3, 4, that sort of thing. So this is proto-writing. And then the earliest evidence of writing is basically in, again, the Fertile Triangle, when after agriculture. Now sophisticated language, the Egyptian hieroglyphs. This is the oldest writing that's been found in Mexico. The record is really poor in the Americas. It wouldn't surprise me if these things go back quite a lot further. But is this an independent evolution of this? Could easily be, which is really interesting. So that suggests that Homo sapiens in separate places, when faced with the same social issues, comes up with the same social solutions, writing. So I don't know a lot about this personally, but it's a very, very interesting but extraordinarily difficult form of scholarship. So that's really recent, right? 10,000 years, 8,000 years, 5,000 years for writing. So language had to exist, but if there's no real grammar here, is it just because they couldn't work out how to put it down, or is it because the grammar didn't exist yet? Now, musical notation is quite recent, 1,000 or 2 years, but I bet you these guys were singing, and singing well. So just because there isn't a written record of it doesn't mean that there wasn't sophisticated speech and storytelling going back maybe 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago when the art's occurring. So we don't want to use our modern standards of what good communication looks like as a measure of when language first emerges. And then this I just couldn't resist putting in. Anybody know what this is? Yeah, very good. In Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Egypt. So about 2,200 years ago, with the hieroglyphs on the top and Greek in the bottom and Demotic sitting in the middle there. So talk about a way of working out how to read hieroglyphs. Otherwise, you're kind of in trouble. So that's the Rosetta Stone. So now I go to the question. Here is a evolutionary tree of a small proportion of human languages. So there's Russian, Latvian, English, German, French. There's Mandarin sitting in there. There's Hindi sitting in there. So that's the Indo-European group. And there are a variety of linguistic approaches suggesting that this is about 8,000 to 9,500 years ago. Now the question is this is the rate of evolution of linguistic structures and words. So that suggests that the last common ancestor of all language is only about 10 or 12,000 years ago. But there are two weaknesses of the argument. The first is that there might have been language that didn't change very much for 20,000 years, and then it starts to differentiate when you start getting farming spreading across the world. The second one is the last common ancestor of, when's the coalescence time for Homo sapiens? About 200,000. But Homo erectus goes back deeper than that to 1.6 million. So just because the coalescence time of modern languages is whenever it is, doesn't mean there wasn't language before it. And languages go extinct as people wipe groups out. So the use of living languages to estimate the origin of language is not generally recommended, and people don't do it. And then we get industrialization, the beginning of large cities. And so here's Manchester in about 1850 with all of its milling, cotton factories and pollutions. So I just want to point out, too, that there are other species that build amazing cities. And so this is a leafcutter ant nest. What they did is they poured about 10 tons of water and concrete into the nest, let it set, and then excavated it out. So that's the size of the nest. It was home to about 8 million ants. It has about 238 chambers where they farm fungus. So they're the leafcutter ants cutting leaves. Why are they cutting leaves? They don't eat them. So what are they doing with them? Feeding the fungus. So they're farming the fungus by feeding the fungus. Right? So farming, social behavior, cities, complex organization occur in other species too, of which the social insect ants, bees, wasps are, of course, famous. Okay. Evolutionary medicine. Impact of agriculture and industrialization and the development of what we call non-infectious mismatched diseases. And the mismatch is the mismatch between our current lifestyle and the vast depth of our evolutionary origins. With agriculture and industrialization, we changed the way we use our bodies and our nutrition. So since the emergence of Homo erectus 1.7 million years ago, 99.5% of our history has been dominated by selective pressures associated with hunter, gathering, and endurance running. That's what our biology is determined by. And in this last snippet of time, this last 0.5%, we've become sedentary with excess food of different kinds as well as feast and famine. And so here is a lower jaw of a hunter-gatherer, and here's one of a Neolithic about 8,000 years ago. This can't see it here, lots of cavities. So cavities start to appear because you start to concentrate sugars. Here is sort of the early hunter-gatherers, about 40,000 years ago in terms of height. And with the increase of agriculture meant narrower diets, but also occasionally famines and plagues, which selected for smaller body size or just less food. You just gave less food. So in 1800, this is the average size of a Frenchman. And then with industrialization, it's back up to being big again. So we shrunk somewhat during the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic. But the excess food means we have especially high energy storage foods, fats and sugars. If you're a hunter-gatherer living in an environment where there's hardly any food, which is why you're beginning to work out how to forage in long distance, you're always hungry. So if you've got availability of really rich, fatty food, you eat it. So you can store it waiting for the next 4 or 5 months or 6 months until you can catch another wildebeest again. So our biology is specifically designed to store high-energy foods for those lean times. We don't have those lean times anymore. So we eat sugar and fats, and we just take it on, and we just bulk up. So that's our hunter-gatherer heritage talking to us through our bodies, through our cravings. We have massively decreased activity. I'll show you that in a moment in terms of calorie uses. Huge decreased physical stress, particularly during growth. So how many of you had impacted wisdom teeth? Yeah. You don't see any evidence of impacted wisdom teeth in any of these pre-farming fossils. Don't exist. They died, then you'd expect to see them, right? Why? As you bite hard food, it actually helps shape the jaw and the muscles. As the muscles strengthen, they've strengthened the bone lengthens. Because we eat soft food, we're not stressing the bone, the jaw's been shrinking, and the teeth get jammed. So our diet, soft diet, is responsible for things like impacted wisdom teeth. So I remember as a kid thinking, oh my God, imagine if I was 10,000 years ago, what would I do if I had impacted wisdom teeth? The answer is I wouldn't, probably. And a cleaner environment. And this is really important. There are things like Crohn's disease and allergies. The immune system is designed to deal with a really hostile world, finds other and attacks it. We've got rid of the hostile world to large part. So the immune system says, I'm an army, I've got to fight somebody. Oh, that's a little bit different, and attacks you. And that produces Crohn's disease and rashes, allergies. So there are some solutions now where people who have really severe problems actually take things like tapeworms. They infect themselves with parasites to give the immune system a better sense of what it's supposed to be doing so that it leaves the body alone and goes after the real enemy. And so just this is for back injury, but you need some consistent loading of your bones to strengthen it properly. Too much and it breaks. Too little and it starts to atrophy. So you have to load the bones. So for things like osteoporosis for women, it's not just enough to take calcium. You actually have to strengthen the structure of the bone by loading the bone. How do you load the bone? Well, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you're exercising, you're carrying things, you're moving on the ground all the time, you're locomoting. And so here's, again, it's a guess, it's a cartoon. This is bone mass as you grow. And then through menopause, you start to lose bone mass, but it's fine in terms of the osteoporosis line. But if you're not laying down as much bone and it isn't as strong, then you can cross that line, get osteoporosis. So it's not that there's any genes for osteoporosis. It's the fact that we've switched from our hunter-gatherer heritage of 1.5 million years to farming and industrialization for 10,000 years. We've changed the way we use our body in a way that then puts us now in this zone for sorts of diseases. So there ain't going to be a gene for osteoporosis. There isn't a simple cure. It's because we're not using our body in the same way. And so this is just a calorie. Knitting is about 70 calories per hour. Household chores about 200. Gardening 300. Coal mining 400. Loading a truck. But there's endurance running. 600 to 1,500. So we have more food available to us and we're using less calories, both. And so I'm going to post this slide. These are sort of the lists of diseases that are thought to be called the so-called mismatched diseases, where there's a mismatch between what our body has been selected for over the last 1.5 million years and then the way we're currently living in this very, very narrow time frame of the last 5,000, or since industrialization, a couple of hundred. So our modern history is a radical change of our evolutionary history, and that's the mismatch, which is really important. And so hence the diagram. Early Homo erectus with its spear tip and its new tools, and then modern man with its agriculture and more effective ways of being tribal. And then I think that's a McDonald's. And so Leslie showed you this diagram of the body mass index in North America growing over the last century, with some dips associated with World War II. So it's really, really quite striking. And so finally, I want to get back to the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution did something really quite remarkable, and it's not just the industrial part, it's industrial farming. And so if we go back to about 5,000 years ago, there looked like there were in the order of about 14 million people. I don't know how to justify that, but 14 million. And now today, you can see 1800, it was about 1 billion. And then with the Industrial Revolution taking off and the food revolution, the green revolution, we're now at about 7 billion. So 5,000 years ago, so there's writing, the Egypt pyramids are there, there's art, there's farming in a fairly sophisticated way, the Phoenicians. For every person alive 5,000 years ago, there's now 500 people. For every one Egyptian, there's now 500 Egyptians. For every one French person, there's 500 French. For every Chinese, there's 500. So we've increased our population size 500-fold in just up 5,000 years. And that has put incredible pressure and started to change the shape of the way we influence the Earth. And basically, to presage next lecture, we've become a potent geologic force through the weight of our industrialization and the weight of our vast numbers. And so next lecture then starts with our transformation of the planet. So we'll see you next week.